The metal edge of the shovel screamed against the hidden layer of sheer ice beneath the fresh powder snow. Kiam! The sharp, grating cry ripped through the heavy, muffling silence of the biting January morning. It echoed off the identical, snow-laden houses lining Aspen Lane, a sound unnervingly loud in the frozen stillness. Carlos Martinez gasped, his breath exploding in a ragged white plume against the frigid air. It stung his lungs. His arms, scarecrow-thin beneath layers of worn, inadequate clothing, trembled violently, not just from the cold, but from the sheer, burning effort of trying to pry the heavy, snow-packed scoop free. It was stuck fast. He shifted his weight, planting his boots as firmly as he could. The metal braces supporting his legs, partially hidden beneath his thin snow pants, groaned in protest. They offered stability, but on the treacherous, uneven surface of the expansive driveway, slick with hidden ice, every movement was a precarious gamble. His footing slipped slightly. He caught himself with a jolt that sent a fresh wave of exhaustion through his already aching muscles. Each thrust of the shovel, each attempt to lift and toss the dense snow, was a monumental battle. A painful, exhausting negotiation between his fierce determination and the frustrating limitations of muscles hampered by cerebral palsy. Coordination, a challenge on the best of days, became a Herculean task in this icy battlefield. The packed snow, heavy and wet from the brief thaw yesterday before the temperature plummeted overnight, felt like resisting concrete. It clung to the shovel, adding impossible weight, mocking his slight, 12-year-old frame. He gritted his teeth, jaw tight against the shiver that racked his body. He tried to ignore the deep, penetrating cold that had long ago seeped through his worn boots and thin gloves, rendering his fingers and toes numb, clumsy logs. He focused instead on the burning sensation in his shoulders, the fire in his back. He ignored the tremor that shook him constantly now, a tremor born not just of the sub-zero wind chill, but of profound, bone-deep fatigue. He had to keep going. He couldn't stop. He had to finish this vast, accusing expanse of white. His mother's anxious face flashed in his mind, the fear in her eyes. He had to. Behind the gleaming, energy-efficient, double-paned bay window of the immaculate house that presided over the driveway, Carol Albright watched, observed, judged. Her posture was ramrod straight, spine rigid against the plush velvet of her armchair. Her sharp, angular features, framed by expertly highlighted blonde hair, were arranged in an expression of cool, detached assessment. Evaluating effort, noting inefficiency, she raised a delicate porcelain teacup to her lips, sipping the steaming, fragrant Earl Grey. The cup, imported bone china, felt pleasantly warm against her manicured fingers. The contrast between her heated, climate-controlled living room and the brutal, wind-whipped conditions Carlos endured just yards away was stark, absolute, and deeply satisfying, in a way she wouldn't articulate, even to herself. Willow Creek Crossing was her domain. Not legally hers, not on paper, perhaps, not entirely, but in spirit, absolutely. In the relentless, day-to-day enforcement of its meticulously crafted image. This wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a statement. A carefully constructed testament to order, propriety, and affluent homogeneity. It was built on unwavering standards, promulgated through the thick binder of HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS that Carol knew by heart, chapter and verse. Here, conformity wasn't merely encouraged, it was mandated, policed, enforced with the unyielding, dispassionate rigor of a military inspection or a state censorship board reviewing potentially subversive material. Deviation was noted, documented, and swiftly rectified. Every lawn was a perfect, weed-free rectangle of prescribed fescue blend in summer, mown to the precise, regulation height. In winter, they became smooth, undisturbed blankets of pristine white. Homeowners contractually obligated to clear sidewalks and driveways within 12 hours of snowfall cessation, using only approved methods. No garish plastic shovels allowed, only sturdy metal or designated snow blowers operating within permitted noise hours. Every fence was the exact mandated height, constructed of approved materials, painted one of the 3 permitted shades of beige or taupe. Every mailbox, a specific, high-end model ordered through the HOA's preferred supplier, stood at perfect attention, identical bronze soldiers guarding the curb in a relentless suburban war against the perceived chaos of individuality or, worse, financial inadequacy. And Carol Albright, a prominent, long-serving, and intensely vocal member of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association Board, currently serving as vice president and chair of the Architectural Review Committee, saw herself not merely as a resident, but as its chief guardian, its ultimate arbiter of aesthetic acceptability, the stern gatekeeper protecting the neighborhood's carefully cultivated exclusivity and, consequently, its inflated property values. The Martinez family, renting the smaller, older split level down the street for the past 6 turbulent months, did not fit Carol's stringent definition of acceptable Willow Creek residents. Not even close. They were outsiders. Transplants. Temporary occupants in a community built on the bedrock of vested homeownership. They were quiet, almost unnervingly so, keeping mostly to themselves. Mr. Martinez left early and returned late, driving a battered pickup truck bearing the logo of a landscaping company. Manual labor, Carol noted with a faint sniff. Mrs. Martinez was sometimes seen walking to the bus stop at the edge of the subdivision, presumably heading to one of the cleaning jobs Carol had heard whispers about from other, more established neighbors. Immigrants. Their accented English, though clear, marked them as different. Their skin tone stood out amongst the predominantly fair-skinned residents. In Carol's meticulously ordered eyes, their very presence was a subtle disruption, a discordant note in the carefully orchestrated symphony of suburban perfection. A hairline crack in the flawless facade she worked so tirelessly, so thanklessly, to maintain. Their rented house, while kept reasonably tidy on the surface, Carol made sure to drive by slowly several times a week, lacked the expensive, bespoke, ARC-approved flourishes that distinguished the owner-occupied properties. No professionally designed landscaping, just basic shrubs. No gleaming brass house numbers, just standard plastic ones. Their car, parked resolutely in the driveway as per HOA rules forbidding street parking overnight, was older, dented, foreign. They didn't participate in the neighborhood's mandatory fun block parties with the requisite forced enthusiasm and obligatory potluck contributions presented in expensive serving dishes. They didn't join the HOA committees. They didn't seem to integrate. They were, in Carol Albright's carefully compartmentalized world, an anomaly, an undesirable variable, a potential drag on the community's pristine image. And today, the heavy, wet snowfall, inconvenient for most, had presented Carol with a perfect opportunity. An opportunity cleverly disguised as neighborly expectation. A chance to reinforce the established hierarchy, wrapped in the language of community contribution. Earlier that morning, shortly after the snow had stopped, Carol had donned her expensive shearling coat and walked the few houses down to the Martinez rental. She found Mrs. Martinez outside, anxiously trying to clear her own narrow front walkway with a woefully inadequate kitchen broom, her movements tentative, her face etched with worry. Carol's approach had been calculated, her tone deceptively mild, almost neighborly, but the underlying steel, the implicit authority of her HOA position, was unmistakable. Mrs. Martinez, Carol had begun, her gaze performing a slow, critical sweep of the rental property's exterior, lingering for a moment on the slightly sagging gutter she'd already mentally noted for a future violation notice. "Good morning. Quite a storm we had." Mrs. Martinez, small and appearing perpetually overwhelmed, had jumped slightly at Carol's voice. She offered a hesitant smile, nodding mutely, clutching the flimsy broom handle like a lifeline. "See. Good morning, Mrs. Albright. Much snow." "Indeed," Carol continued smoothly. "And as you know, it's vital that all residents contribute to maintaining Willow Creek's high standards, especially regarding snow removal. Promptness is key for safety and appearance." She paused, letting the gentle admonishment hang in the frigid air. "My driveway," Carol went on, gesturing vaguely back towards her own expansive, 3-car-wide stretch of concrete, currently untouched by shovel or snow blower, a vast, pristine white rectangle awaiting service. It's quite large this year, with the drifts. Requires significant effort to clear properly, according to regulation. Another pause. Carol studied the younger woman's face, noting the flicker of understanding, the dawning fear in her dark eyes. "Perfect. Your boy, Carlos?" Carol inquired, her tone shifting to one of feigned concern. He seems like a sturdy young man, perhaps a bit cooped up. This weather can be trying for active youngsters. She smiled, a thin, humorless stretching of her lips. I imagine he could benefit from some purposeful outdoor activity. Some fresh air. It builds character, you know. Teaches responsibility. The value of hard work. The words were coated in a sickly sweet layer of false benevolence, but the message beneath resonated with crystalline clarity. Comply, or face the consequences. Unspoken consequences, but easily imagined. A sudden flood of HOA violation notices for minor, previously overlooked infractions. Scrutiny of their rental agreement. Complaints to their landlord, a man Carol knew slightly and could certainly influence. Whispers, perhaps not so quiet, about their immigration status, their suitability for Willow Creek Crossing. The kind of pressure the financially precarious Martinez family desperately wished to avoid, living as they did under the constant, low-grade fear of drawing unwanted attention. Mrs. Martinez's eyes, as Carol had anticipated, had filled with a helpless, cornered fear. She understood perfectly. Her shoulders slumped slightly in defeat. A quiet, coerced agreement had been reached, sealed by unspoken threat and the crushing weight of unequal power. He will come, Mrs. Martinez had whispered, her voice barely audible above the sighing wind. Carlos will clear your driveway, Mrs. Albright. Thank you. Carol had offered another thin smile. Excellent. Community spirit. That's what we value here. So here Carlos was, struggling, shivering, fighting a losing battle against the snow and his own body. While Carol Albright watched from her warm, insulated sanctuary, a faint, almost imperceptible, yet deeply smug smile playing on her lips. This was order being maintained. This was ensuring everyone understood their place, their obligations. This was Willow Creek Crossing, functioning exactly as it should, under her watchful, discerning eye. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, cold as the January wind rattling the expensive window panes, pricked at the edge of Carol's consciousness. A fleeting image, quickly suppressed, but leaving a familiar residue of unease. She was 8 years old, standing rigidly, hands clasped behind her back, in the gleaming, impossibly sterile kitchen of her childhood home. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, dust motes her mother would later decry. Her mother, Eleanor, a woman whose own life revolved around maintaining an impenetrable facade of upper-middle-class perfection, stood before her. Eleanor wasn't looking at Carol, but at the polished chrome surface of the oversized refrigerator door. Her perfectly manicured finger, nail lacquered a precise shade of coral, pointed with trembling intensity at a single, almost invisible fingerprint marring the otherwise flawless surface. A small, greasy smudge left, presumably, by Carol herself. Carolina. Her mother's voice had been low, dangerously quiet, yet vibrating with an intensity that made Carol flinch inwardly. Look at this. Look at it. Carol's eyes followed the pointing finger. The smudge seemed insignificant. Perfection, Carolina. Her mother hissed, her eyes finally snapping towards Carol, cold and sharp. Perfection is not a suggestion. It is not an aspiration. It is a requirement. This house, its appearance, reflects on us. On this family. On your father's standing. Her mother took a step closer, looming over her. Any flaw, any smudge, any imperfection, however minor, is a failure. A public declaration of inadequacy. It is your failure to maintain the standard. The lecture that followed had been long, dissecting Carol's inherent carelessness, her lack of discipline, her failure to appreciate the importance of appearances. The punishment, scrubbing the entire kitchen floor on her hands and knees with a small brush, followed by polishing all the chrome appliances until they gleamed blindingly, had been swift and memorable. That feeling, the tight, suffocating knot of anxiety in her chest, the constant, gnawing fear of falling short, of being judged inadequate, of revealing some hidden flaw, it had never truly left her. It had burrowed deep into the bedrock of her personality, twisting over the decades, metastasizing into this rigid, brittle obsession with control, with imposing an impossible, flawless order on her immediate surroundings, starting with her own meticulously curated home and extending outward, inevitably, to the entire neighborhood she now considered her responsibility. flaws, imperfections, deviations from the norm, like the struggling immigrant family down the street, like a greasy fingerprint on polished chrome. They couldn't be tolerated. They triggered that old, primal fear. They had to be eradicated, polished away, scrubbed out, or punished until they conformed. Carlos's shovel scraped again against the ice, the sound grating, setting Carol's teeth on edge like fingernails on a chalkboard. He was moving so agonizingly slowly now, his progress almost negligible against the vast, daunting expanse of white still covering most of her driveway. His small body shuddered visibly with cold and exhaustion, even from this distance. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the shovel handle, pausing to draw deep, ragged breaths that steamed in the frigid air. Enough observation. He wasn't working efficiently. He needed motivation. Or perhaps it was simply time for the next phase of her plan, the phase that addressed the root cause of the disruption. Carol placed her delicate teacup deliberately, silently, back onto its saucer on the polished mahogany side table. She rose smoothly from her armchair. She picked up her cordless phone from its charging cradle, its familiar weight comfortable in her hand. She walked purposefully towards the back of the house, towards her home office overlooking the snow-covered back garden, away from the front window overlooking the driveway, seeking privacy for this particular, more sensitive communication, ensuring no prying eyes or ears, though the likelihood of anyone observing her within her own home was negligible. Prudence was paramount. Sitting at her large, antique desk, she consulted a small, leather-bound address book, flipping to the I section. She ran her finger down the page and stopped. She had researched and noted the number weeks ago, filed it away under contingency, just in case the Martinezes proved resistant. She dialed the number carefully, her finger pressing the buttons with firm precision. The line clicked, then rang. Once, twice, 3 times. A clipped, professional, slightly bored-sounding male voice answered. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Officer Davies speaking. How may I direct your call? Yes, Carol said, consciously pitching her voice lower, injecting a note of carefully manufactured concern, the unmistakable tone of a responsible citizen fulfilling an unpleasant but necessary civic duty. Good morning. I need to speak with someone regarding a potential situation here in Willow Creek Crossing. It's rather urgent, I believe. A brief pause. The rustle of papers in the background. One moment, ma'am. I'll transfer you to the reporting line. A click, another brief hold filled with tinny synthesized music, then another voice, female this time, equally official, perhaps slightly more alert. I see enforcement and removal operations. How can I help you? Hello, Carol began, lowering her voice further, adopting a conspiratorial whisper. My name is Carol Albright. I reside in Willow Creek Crossing, Illinois. I need to report some suspicious activity. Some concerns I have about a family residing here. Okay, ma'am, the voice replied calmly. Can you give me the address? Yes, it's the Martinez family. Easy. They are renting at number 114, Aspen Lane. She paused dramatically, letting the gravity of her presumed revelation sink in. I'm almost certain the parents are undocumented. What makes you say that, Ms. Albright? The operator asked, her tone neutral, practiced. Carol leaned closer to the phone, weaving her narrative. Well, they only arrived a few months ago, very suddenly. They keep very odd hours, you see. The father leaves before dawn, comes back late. The mother, she seems furtive. They're very secretive, hardly interact with neighbors. It just doesn't feel right. She embellished freely now, layering fiction onto the bedrock of her prejudice. And sometimes there are other cars, unfamiliar ones, coming and going late at night. People I don't recognize visiting them. It feels unsafe, like they might be involved in something illicit, besides just being here illegally. She paused, then played her trump card, the detail she believed would guarantee swift action. And right now, as we speak, they have their poor disabled son out doing hard labor in this blizzard. Shoveling snow, a huge driveway. He can barely walk properly. He wears leg braces. The poor thing looks absolutely frozen and exhausted. It looks dangerous. Frankly, it looks exploitative, like forced child labor. She drew a shaky breath, feigning distress. You really should check them out. Immediately. For the boy's sake, if nothing else. and for the safety of this community. She provided the address again, slowly and clearly, phonetically spelling Aspen Lane. She added a final, concerned sigh for effect. "Thank you for your time. I apologize for taking it, but I just felt it was my solemn duty to report my concerns." "Thank you for the information, Ms. Albright," the operator said coolly. "We will log the report." Carol pressed the end call button, a slow, deeply satisfying, cruel smile spreading across her face. "Perfect. Let them see. Let the federal authorities deal with this disruption. Let the Martinezes finally understand the consequences of not fitting in, of attracting her attention. Order, proper Willow Creek order, would soon be restored." She felt a pleasant warmth spread through her chest, more effective than the expensive tea. Less than 30 minutes later, surprisingly fast, Carol thought with satisfaction, the quiet, snow-muffled stillness of Aspen Lane outside Carol's house erupted. Not with noise, initially, but with light. A kaleidoscope of flashing blue and red lights pulsed urgently, reflecting eerily off the smooth, white surfaces of snowdrifts and frosted roofs, painting the identical, staid house fronts in shifting, frantic colors. Carol moved quickly back to her front bay window, peering through the sheer inner curtains, a flutter of triumphant anticipation in her chest. She expected to see perhaps a single, discreet dark sedan or SUV, the kind she imagined ICE agents used for quiet apprehensions. Instead, what she saw made her breath catch sharply in her throat. Her smug satisfaction evaporated, replaced by a sudden, cold prickle of unease. It wasn't one car. It wasn't two. It was a convoy. Two marked local Willow Creek police cruisers, lights silently, hypnotically revolving. They were blocking the ends of the street. Several dark, nondescript sedans with tinted windows and official government license plates. And, most alarmingly, a larger passenger van, clearly marked with the official gold and blue seal of the state of Illinois Attorney General's office. They pulled onto Aspen Lane with practiced, coordinated precision, parking strategically, effectively boxing in the area around Carol's house and the Martinez rental property down the block. Doors opened, and figures emerged into the biting cold. Uniformed local police officers taking up positions. Several individuals in plain clothes, suits, and heavy overcoats, carrying themselves with an unmistakable air of crisp, focused authority. They moved with a quiet, purposeful intensity that radiated seriousness. This was more. Much more than Carol had anticipated. Far more than a simple immigration status check. This felt different, bigger, more organized. Leading the group, stepping out of one of the lead unmarked sedans, was a tall man whose image Carol vaguely recognized from televised press conferences. He wore a heavy, tailored charcoal overcoat, his posture erect, his gaze sharp and assessing as he surveyed the scene. The struggling boy still leaning on the shovel, the growing number of curious neighbors peeking from behind curtains, the array of official vehicles now dominating the quiet suburban street. His presence commanded immediate, unspoken attention. A knot of confusion and nascent panic tightened in Carol's stomach. What in God's name was actually going on? This wasn't the script she had written. The initial flashing lights belonged to two vehicles from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, just as Carol had requested. They pulled up first, parking directly across from the Martinez rental. Two agents in standard ICE vests got out. Carol watched from her window, a surge of vindication warming her. Finally, they saw Carlos struggling, saw his parents watching anxiously from the porch. One agent started walking towards the Martinez property. Carol allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. Phase 1 complete. But before the ICE agent could reach the Martinez walkway, the rest of the convoy arrived. The local police cruisers sealing the street. The unmarked state cars pulling in behind the ICE vehicles. The van bearing the Attorney General's seal. The two ICE agents paused, looking surprised, then conferred briefly with one of the plainclothes individuals who emerged from a state car. There was a nod, a brief exchange, and the ICE agent stepped back, observing, effectively ceding the lead to the state officials. The man Carol recognized, State Attorney General David Riley, stepped out, his sharp eyes taking in the entire tableau. Carol's triumphant smile froze, then vanished. This wasn't an ICE operation she had initiated. This was something else entirely. Something coordinated. Something aimed elsewhere. The truth began to dawn, cold and terrifying. Her call hadn't been the start of something. It had been the trigger for something already in motion. Unbeknownst to Carol Albright, her vindictive, weaponized call to ICE hadn't initiated this impressive state response. It had merely, and ironically, accelerated it. It provided the perfect, unexpected, real-time trigger for an operation already weeks, if not months, in the making. The Office of State Attorney General David Riley, spurred by his personal interest in combating exploitation hidden in plain sight, had been quietly, meticulously building a complex case. Anonymous tips, followed by more formal, confidential complaints, had surfaced regarding predatory and potentially criminal practices within certain affluent suburban homeowners associations across the state. A disturbing pattern had emerged from the whispers and cautious reports. Allegations of vulnerable residents, often elderly individuals on fixed incomes, recent immigrants navigating unfamiliar systems, or families facing temporary financial hardship, being systematically coerced into performing unpaid labor, providing personal services, or complying with increasingly unreasonable demands. The leverage? The omnipresent threat of crippling, often entirely fabricated or disproportionately applied, HOA fines, special assessments, liens placed on their property, and relentless, targeted harassment designed to make their lives unbearable. Willow Creek Crossing, and specifically the frequently mentioned name of Carol Albright, chair of the Architectural Review Committee, had appeared multiple times in these disturbing, confidential reports compiled by Riley's Special Prosecutions Bureau. Tales, cautiously relayed, of manufactured violations appearing out of thin air, grass marginally too long, holiday decorations left up 12 hours past the deadline, a slightly faded paint color on trim, exorbitant penalties assessed, sometimes running into thousands of dollars. Penalties that were then mysteriously forgiven or significantly reduced, but only in exchange for hours upon hours of volunteer work. Extensive yard maintenance at communal properties heavily favored by Carol, meticulous house cleaning services provided directly to Carol, repeated car washing and detailing for Carol's luxury SUV, even running personal errands for Carol. Always off the books, always leveraging fear. Riley's dedicated team of investigators were already deep in the process. They were setting up discrete surveillance points, planning carefully controlled interactions with potential victims and witnesses, building the complex evidentiary foundation needed for search warrants, subpoenas, and potential grand jury indictments targeting not just individuals like Carol, but potentially the systemic issues within the HOA structure itself. Then came Carol's malicious call to ICE, automatically flagged and cross-referenced through state and federal interagency communication protocols. A report alleging possible child labor and questionable immigration status originating from precisely the address already deeply flagged in an active, high-priority state investigation into potential forced labor, exploitation, and human trafficking violations. It was the perfect storm, the unexpected catalyst, the immediate, undeniable justification to pivot from covert observation to overt, decisive action. The state's carefully constructed investigation suddenly had fresh, actionable probable cause spilling out onto the snow-covered pavement of Aspen Lane, embodied by the shivering boy leaning on the shovel. Attorney General David Riley, intensely committed to combating these insidious forms of modern exploitation that thrived in the shadows of perceived respectability, decided instantly to oversee the initial contact personally. This case had the potential to set a major precedent. He watched now, his expression grim, as Carlos, utterly spent, leaned heavily on the shovel handle, his small body trembling uncontrollably, violently. The boy's face, even from a distance, was alarmingly pale, tinged with blue around the lips, stark against the gray, unforgiving winter sky. Just as Riley began to stride purposefully towards the boy and the driveway where he labored, Carol Albright chose that precise, fateful moment to step out onto her own meticulously cleared, heated front porch. She pulled her expensive, cream-colored shearling coat tighter around herself, adjusting the collar, adopting an air of unimpeachable righteous authority, assuming, still, that this impressive display of law enforcement was ultimately about her complaint. "Well, it's certainly about time someone responded," she called out loudly, her voice sharp with assumed command, directed towards the assembled officials generally, but particularly towards the two IC agents now standing passively near their vehicles. She clearly believed this entire assembly was, at its core, for the benefit of the Martinez family's removal, a validation of her civic vigilance. She then turned her full attention, and her considerable ire, towards the struggling boy. "You haven't finished yet, boy," she snapped, her voice devoid of any shred of warmth or human concern, sharp as shattered ice. "Look at this mess you're still making of my driveway. Don't you dare think you can slack off and waste time just because there's a bit of a commotion going on." Attorney General David Riley instantly changed direction. With long, purposeful strides, he stepped directly into Carol Albright's intended path before she could take another step off her porch towards the exhausted, vulnerable child. His movement was smooth, deliberate, physically intercepting her trajectory, forcing her to halt abruptly. "Ma'am," his voice was dangerously calm, perfectly level, yet it carried an undeniable weight, a resonant authority that cut through the biting wind and Carol's shrill pronouncements. He stopped directly in front of her, standing on the public sidewalk just below her porch steps, creating a clear boundary. Carol blinked, momentarily taken aback, flustered by the direct, unexpected confrontation from this imposing, well-dressed man who clearly wasn't an IC agent. "Yes?" she asked, impatience and indignation coloring her tone. "Can I help you? Are you in charge here?" "As I was telling your colleagues," she nodded towards the passive IC agents, "I'm the one who called about the illegal family down the street. They need to be dealt with." She gestured dismissively with a gloved hand towards the Martinez house, where other plainclothes officers were now speaking calmly and reassuringly, through a translator, to Mr. and Mrs. Martinez, who had emerged fully onto their small porch, alerted by Carol's shouting and the overwhelming official presence. Riley didn't immediately confirm or deny his role. His gaze remained steady, intense, searching her face. "You mean your call to Immigration and Customs Enforcement this morning, Ms. Albright?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly, becoming colder, sharper. "Regarding the Martinez family at 114 Aspen Lane, alleging undocumented status and child labor?" "Yes, exactly," Carol affirmed, regaining some of her bluster, mistaking his question for confirmation. "It's about time action was taken. This neighborhood has standards." Riley allowed a brief, almost imperceptible pause. His eyes flickered towards Carlos, still shivering under the watchful eye of a female investigator. "That call was interesting, Ms. Albright," he said slowly, drawing out the word, letting it hang in the frigid air between them. "Especially, as it turns out, when cross-referenced with several other ongoing reports and investigations my particular office has been receiving regarding certain activities here in Willow Creek Crossing." He held her gaze. "I'm State Attorney General David Riley, and you are Carol Albright." The title, stated so plainly, so unexpectedly, hit Carol like a physical blow. State Attorney General, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of Illinois, here, on her street, talking to her? Her mind raced, scrambling, desperately trying to process this inexplicable, profoundly alarming development. The ground seemed to shift beneath her expensive boots. Confusion warred violently with a rising tide of ice-cold panic. Yes, I'm Carol Albright," she stammered, her carefully constructed composure abruptly beginning to fray, then crumble, at the edges. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking suddenly haggard beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Attorney General? But, I don't understand. Why are you here?" This is about the undocumented family, the illegal immigrants." Riley's gaze hardened, shifting again, briefly but pointedly, towards Carlos. The boy was watching the exchange now with wide, frightened, intelligent eyes, shivering violently despite his layers. He swayed slightly on his feet, leaning more heavily on the shovel for support. From the Martinez porch, his mother, Elena, let out a small, choked cry, quickly muffled by her husband Roberto's comforting hand on her shoulder. "We are certainly looking into all aspects of the situation here this morning, Ms. Albright," Riley stated clearly, his attention snapping back entirely to her, his voice regaining its sharp edge. "Including, I assure you, the veracity and motivation behind reports made to federal law enforcement authorities." His voice turned colder still, each word delivered with deliberate weight. But my office, the Attorney General's office, is primarily here today because we have received multiple, credible, corroborated reports suggesting that you, Miss Carol Albright, may be personally involved in a disturbing and potentially criminal pattern of coercing residents, vulnerable residents, into providing substantial unpaid labor and personal services under direct threat of punitive, often fabricated, HOA action. He nodded curtly, almost imperceptibly, towards the trembling boy just yards away. Forcing this child, Carlos Martinez, to perform strenuous, potentially harmful manual labor for hours in these dangerous, sub-freezing weather conditions, particularly given his documented physical challenges which you referenced in your call to IC, could, on its own, constitute felony child endangerment under Illinois statute. He took a slight step closer, lowering his voice slightly but increasing its intensity. And depending on the specific circumstances, the nature of the threats made to his family, threats we have reason to believe were explicitly made, it could potentially link to a much more serious, ongoing pattern of forced labor, which, I must remind you, Ms. Albright, under both state and federal law, constitutes a serious felony, human trafficking. Trafficking. The word exploded from Carol, a strangled shriek of incredulous, indignant outrage. Her face flushed a blotchy, furious crimson, then drained rapidly again, leaving her skin pale and clammy-looking, even in the biting cold. That's preposterous. Utterly absurd. How dare you? I am a respected member of this community. I have lived here for 15 years. I serve diligently on the HOA board. I uphold standards. I ensure property values. The boy was he was contributing, doing his part, earning his family's keep in this neighborhood. Contributing? Riley echoed, his voice dropping dangerously low now, laced with a cold, controlled fury that was more intimidating than shouting. Is that what you call it, Ms. Albright? Contributing? Or was he working off fabricated fines maliciously levied against his parents? Were his parents threatened? Were they explicitly told, Ms. Albright, that they would face exorbitant financial penalties, perhaps liens on their rented property leading to eviction, or perhaps even repeated, targeted reports to immigration authorities, exactly like the one you just admitted to making, if they didn't comply with your demands for unpaid work? Demands for work like shoveling your entire 3-car driveway in a blizzard. Carlos, overhearing the Attorney General's sharp, specific questions, let out a small, sharp gasp. His eyes darted towards his parents on the porch, a look of dawning understanding mixed with fear passing over his young face. Then his gaze snapped back to the tall, imposing man who seemed to be defending him. He shivered again, a violent, racking tremor that shook his whole small body from head to toe. Seeing the boy's acute distress, the blue tinge deepening around his lips, Riley immediately paused the interrogation. He held up a hand slightly towards Carol, a silent command to wait. He made a quiet gesture towards his team. One of the plainclothes investigators, a woman with kind, steady eyes who Carlos later learned was a specialist in child victim interviews, immediately began moving purposefully towards Carlos. But before she reached him, Riley did something entirely unexpected, something profoundly human. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his own heavy, expensive wool overcoat. Standing exposed to the biting wind in only his suit jacket, seemingly oblivious to the cold himself, he stepped quickly across the short distance to where Carlos stood shivering. Gently, carefully, he draped the large, warm coat over the boy's narrow, trembling shoulders. The coat engulfed Carlos completely, falling almost to his knees. Its heavy warmth was immediate, shocking, penetrating the layers of cold that had seeped into his bones. Its sheer weight felt strangely comforting, protective. It smelled faintly of wool and cold morning air, and something else Carlos couldn't quite place. Authority, perhaps, but a kind, protective authority. Safety. Carlos looked up, startled, into the Attorney General's serious but unexpectedly kind eyes. He saw a flicker of something there, empathy, anger on his behalf. He pulled the coat instinctively tighter around himself, burying his face for a moment in the warm, dark wool, overwhelmed. On the porch, Elena Martinez burst into quiet, unrestrained, relieved sobs, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. Roberto Martinez murmured soothing words to her in Spanish, but his own eyes, fixed on the Attorney General with fierce gratitude, were suspiciously bright. This small, simple, human gesture, the state's highest law enforcement officer wrapping his own coat around a shivering, exploited child, hung powerfully in the frigid air. It spoke volumes, a potent, silent counterpoint to Carol Albright's brittle accusations, her cold demands, her utter lack of compassion. It shifted the moral landscape of the scene irrevocably. Carol Albright watched, momentarily stunned into silence, her mouth slightly agape. She sputtered, trying desperately to regain control, to formulate a coherent defense, to somehow twist this development to her advantage. This is all a complete misunderstanding. A terrible fabrication. These people, they are manipulating you. But Riley had already turned away from her slightly, his focus shifting back to the coordinated operation now unfolding rapidly around them. He signaled his team. The investigation, meticulously planned but rapidly adapted to the morning's events, moved into high gear. Investigators, armed with clipboards and official identification, began methodically fanning out, approaching neighbors who had cautiously emerged from their homes, drawn by the sustained official presence and the obvious drama unfolding at Carol Albright's property line. An elderly woman, Mrs. Gable from 2 doors down, initially hesitant, spoke in hushed tones to a female investigator, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength, fueled by years of quiet resentment. She recounted, with growing indignation, how Carol had threatened her with a $500 fine and ARC violation for rose bushes deemed aesthetically non-compliant and potentially invasive, a fine that was magically waived only after Mrs. Gable, despite her painful arthritis, spent 2 full Saturdays meticulously weeding the extensive communal garden beds near the subdivision entrance, a well-known pet project of Carol's. Another neighbor, a younger man named Peterson, reluctantly admitted under careful, persistent questioning by another investigator that Carol had repeatedly pressured his teenage son, Jason, into washing her luxury SUV multiple times over the summer. She called it detailing, expected him to use his own supplies. Peterson muttered angrily, to avoid hefty, accumulating daily penalties. Carol threatened after personally reporting Jason for accidentally leaving his portable basketball hoop at the curb overnight, a minor infraction rarely enforced against others. One senior investigator, carrying a slim, official-looking portfolio, approached Carol again, interrupting her fragmented, panicked denials. "Ms. Albright," he stated formally, his tone professional but firm, pursuant to the investigative authority granted to the Office of the Attorney General under state statute, "we will require immediate, voluntary access to all Willow Creek Crossing Homeowners Association financial records, including budgets, expenditures, fine assessments and collections, as well as all relevant meeting minutes, violation notices, and correspondence related to resident fines, violations, and any documented volunteer service agreements for the past 2 years." He opened the portfolio just slightly, deliberately, revealing the official state seal embossed in gold on the documents within. "Your cooperation would be advisable. Otherwise, we are prepared to secure the necessary warrants." Simultaneously, the trained clinical social worker from the Attorney General's Victim Advocacy Unit, the one with the kind eyes, gently approached Carlos and his parents. Another plainclothes officer, fluent in Spanish, stood beside her, providing calm, sensitive translation. Speaking softly, reassuringly, the social worker explained their rights in this situation, their right to safety, to support, to legal counsel if needed. She assured them, repeatedly, that they were not the targets of this investigation, but were considered potential victims of exploitation, and that the Attorney General's office was there to help and protect them. She offered immediate support services, warmth, food, connection to legal aid, counseling resources, learning definitively that the state attorney general himself was intervening on their behalf, realizing with dawning, overwhelming relief that they were not about to be deported, but were instead potential key witnesses under the state's protection. Roberto and Elena Martinez began to speak. The dam of fear, silence, and shame finally broke. Through Elena's tearful Spanish, meticulously translated by the accompanying officer, they recounted the story. The constant, grinding pressure they had lived under since Carol Albright had first taken unwelcome notice of them shortly after they moved in. The veiled threats that quickly escalated to explicit ones. The fear that permeated their daily lives. They confirmed, their voices trembling but clear, that Carol had directly, repeatedly threatened them with crippling HOA sanctions for imaginary infractions, with initiating eviction proceedings through their landlord, a man they knew Carol also intimidated with her HOA clout, and, most terrifyingly, with repeated, anonymous calls to IC if they didn't comply with her escalating, unreasonable demands for unpaid labor. Labor like cleaning her large flagstone patio and expensive outdoor furniture in the late fall, stacking multiple cords of firewood delivered to Carol's property, and now, culminating in this morning's demand, forcing Carlos, despite his obvious, visible physical limitations, to shovel her entire, enormous driveway in a dangerous winter storm. Work far beyond his capacity, work that terrified them but which they felt powerless to refuse. Faced with the swift, systematic dismantling of her carefully constructed authority, the mounting evidence pouring in from neighbors, the damning, tearful testimony of the Martinez family confirming her threats and coercion, and the cold, unwavering, analytical scrutiny of the state attorney general and his assembled team, Carol Albright's arrogant, defiant facade finally shattered completely, irrevocably. Raw panic flared in her eyes, wide and animalistic. Her frantic denials became weaker, more fragmented, nonsensical. This is insane, a conspiracy, a misunderstanding. I volunteer countless hours. I'm a pillar of this community. They're lying. Attorney General David Riley held up a hand, palm out, a silent, final command for silence. She stopped, her mouth still working, but no sound emerging. He exchanged a brief, grim look with his lead investigator, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The threshold had been crossed. Carol Albright, Riley stated, his voice suddenly devoid of its earlier anger or intensity, now chillingly formal, purely official, resonant with the full weight of the law he embodied. Based on direct witness testimony received from multiple parties, corroborating accounts indicating a clear pattern of coercive practices leveraging your HOA position for personal gain and intimidation, the clear and present endangerment of a minor child through forced labor under hazardous conditions, and your own admission moments ago of making a knowingly false and malicious report to federal law enforcement authorities. He paused, his gaze locking firmly with hers, allowing the full weight of his words to land. You are under arrest. A uniformed Illinois State Police officer, who had been standing quietly nearby, stepped forward smoothly, purposefully. As one officer began reading Carol her Miranda rights from a small laminated card, the familiar words sounding stark and brutal in the cold morning air, another officer gently but firmly turned her around and secured handcuffs behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of the cuffs locking seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in the sudden, profound silence that had fallen over the street. The woman who had wielded her petty HOA power like a monarch dispensing arbitrary judgments, who had terrorized vulnerable residents and endangered a child out of spite, prejudice, and a pathologically twisted need for control, was now stripped bare of all authority, all pretense. She was simply a criminal suspect, facing the formidable, impersonal power of the state she had tried to manipulate. The primary charges, Riley murmured quietly, almost clinically, to his deputy chief as they watched Carol, stumbling slightly, her face a mask of stunned disbelief and dawning terror, being led towards an unmarked state police car, will include, at minimum, human trafficking through forced labor under the Illinois Safe Haven Act, felony child endangerment, intimidation, and likely federal charges for making false statements to ICE. Given the clear evidence of a pattern of practice, the vulnerability of the victims, and her calculated intent, she's looking at a very, very long time behind bars. Likely north of 25 years, possibly more if the federal charges stick. The news of Carol Albright's dramatic arrest, spearheaded personally by the state attorney general on charges, including human trafficking related to HOA exploitation, sent immediate shockwaves not just through the insulated enclave of Willow Creek Crossing, but across the state, and, amplified by social media, rapidly across the nation. It was the lead story on local news, and quickly picked up by national outlets fascinated by the nexus of suburban privilege, HOA overreach, and serious criminal allegations. Within 24 hours, the hashtag #SnowShovelJustice wasn't just trending. It had surpassed 1 million mentions and engagements online, fueled by a potent cocktail of public outrage over the egregious abuse of HOA power, profound sympathy for Carlos and the Martinez family, and a grim satisfaction at seeing perceived entitlement meet serious consequences. News reports featured stark visuals: the unassuming, snow-covered suburban street suddenly swarming with official vehicles, the jarring contrast between Carol's opulent, perfectly maintained house and the image of the small, shivering boy forced to labor in the cold, wrapped in the Attorney General's oversized coat. The Attorney General's office issued a formal, detailed statement outlining the serious charges against Carol Albright, pointedly including the state-level human trafficking statute related to forced labor, and emphasizing the existence of an ongoing, broader investigation into similar predatory HOA practices statewide. They publicly commended the bravery of the Martinez family and other Willow Creek residents who had risked retaliation to come forward and provide crucial testimony. Under the direct protection, guidance, and vigorous advocacy of the AG's dedicated Victim Services Unit, the Martinez family, though initially fearful and overwhelmed, agreed to cooperate fully with the prosecution of Carol Albright. Their testimony was deemed crucial, recognizing their unique and vulnerable position as both victims of and essential witnesses in a significant state prosecution involving documented elements of human trafficking. Attorney General Riley took the extraordinary step of personally intervening and liaising directly with high-level officials at the Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. He submitted a powerful, detailed request advocating strongly for U visas for the entire Martinez family. U visas are specifically designated for victims of certain qualifying crimes, including trafficking and felonious assault, who suffer substantial harm and provide significant assistance to law enforcement investigations or prosecutions. Given the high-profile nature of the Albright case, the clear documentation of the family's victimization and cooperation, and the strong, direct advocacy from the state's chief law enforcement officer, the federal review process was significantly expedited. Within a few remarkable months, long before Carol Albright's complex trial proceedings even concluded, the Martinez family received the life-altering, tearfully welcome news. Their application for U visas had been fully approved. This crucial step placed them on a secure, protected path toward lawful permanent residency in the United States. The constant, gnawing, paralyzing fear of discovery and deportation, the very fear Carol Albright had so knowingly and cruelly exploited as leverage, was finally, blessedly, irrevocably lifted from their lives. They could finally breathe. Carol Albright's trial became a major media event, a focal point for intense public discussion and legislative debate about the potential for abuse within the often opaque and unchecked power structures of homeowners associations, and the hidden exploitation of vulnerable populations occurring even within seemingly idyllic suburban communities. The prosecution, led by one of the Attorney General's most experienced senior deputies, methodically laid out the damning case against Carol. They presented HOA financial records revealing suspicious patterns of waived fines correlating with undocumented volunteer work. They called neighbor after neighbor who testified, often emotionally, painting a clear, consistent picture of Carol's long-standing pattern of intimidation, coercion, and abuse of her board position for personal gain and vindictive satisfaction. The emotional core of the trial, however, was the testimony of Roberto, Elena, and Carlos Martinez. Accompanied by translators and victim advocates, they recounted, with quiet dignity and palpable pain, the constant fear they lived under, the specific threats Carol made regarding ICE, and the demoralizing, often physically demanding, unpaid labor they felt forced to perform. Carlos, now 13, taller, and bolstered by months of support and therapy, testified quietly but firmly, his voice gaining confidence as he described the freezing cold, the exhaustion, and the suffocating fear Carol Albright had instilled in him that January morning. His testimony, delivered with simple honesty, was devastatingly effective. Carol's expensive defense team struggled mightily, attempting to portray her as a misunderstood, perhaps overzealous, but ultimately well-intentioned community volunteer merely trying to uphold necessary standards in the face of resident apathy. They argued the contributions were voluntary, the threats misconstrued, the child endangerment claim exaggerated. Their arguments crumbled, sounding hollow and increasingly desperate against the sheer weight and consistency of the evidence documenting Carol's calculated cruelty, her deliberate exploitation of vulnerability, and her undeniable willingness to endanger a disabled child to enforce her warped sense of order. The jury, visibly moved by the victim testimonies and presented with overwhelming evidence, deliberated for only a few hours before returning a unanimous verdict, guilty, on all counts, including the most serious charge of human trafficking through forced labor under state law. At the subsequent sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a scathing rebuke, his voice ringing with judicial condemnation, echoing the Attorney General's initial assessment of the crime's profound gravity and societal impact. "Ms. Albright," the judge stated, fixing her with a stern gaze across the courtroom, "you deliberately twisted a position of minor community authority, a position predicated on trust and service, into a cruel tool of personal oppression and exploitation." He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly but gaining intensity. "You preyed upon the inherent vulnerability of your neighbors, particularly the Martinez family, systematically exploiting their fear, their financial insecurity, and their precarious immigration status, a status you yourself threatened to weaponize, all for your own benefit, your convenience, and your perverse, pathologically controlling sense of order. Your actions, culminating in the callous endangerment of a disabled child forced into hard labor during dangerous conditions, represent a profound, sickening betrayal of trust and a flagrant disregard for fundamental human decency." Carol Albright, pale and trembling, stood motionless as the sentence was pronounced, 28 years in the Illinois state prison system. Furthermore, the court ordered significant financial restitution. Her considerable personal assets, including the valuable, meticulously maintained house in Willow Creek Crossing, the very fortress from which she had dispensed her petty tyranny, were subject to immediate forfeiture and liquidation proceedings under state asset forfeiture laws related to human trafficking convictions. A substantial portion of the liquidated funds was ordered to be allocated specifically for restitution to her victims, primarily the Martinez family, to compensate for the economic and emotional ordeal they suffered, and to provide ongoing support for Carlos's medical, therapeutic, and educational needs. Life in Willow Creek Crossing began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, in the months and years following Carol Albright's dramatic downfall and lengthy imprisonment. The Homeowners Association, facing intense public scrutiny, potential civil lawsuits from other victimized residents, and widespread internal dissent fueled by shame and anger, underwent a painful but necessary radical restructuring. The old guard, including Carol's former allies on the board, resigned under pressure or were decisively voted out in a special election marked by unprecedented resident turnout. New bylaws were drafted and adopted, with input from legal experts specializing in HOA reform, emphasizing transparency, accountability, conflict resolution through mediation, and genuine resident support rather than punitive, arbitrary enforcement based on personal vendettas. The infamous Architectural Review Committee was reformed, its powers significantly curtailed. The atmosphere on the quiet, tree-lined streets began to shift, subtly thawing from one of whispered complaints, simmering resentments, and underlying fear, towards one of cautious neighborliness, open communication, and a shared desire to heal the community's fractured reputation. Neighbors made a conscious, visible effort to be more welcoming and inclusive, particularly towards the Martinez family. Roberto, Elena, and Carlos, now secure in their legal status and buoyed by the outpouring of genuine community support and apology, made the courageous decision to stay in Willow Creek Crossing. With financial assistance from the restitution fund, they were eventually able to purchase the very house they had rented, transforming it from a place overshadowed by fear into a true home, filled with newfound security and belonging. They started participating in block parties, their contributions now offered freely, warmly received. Carlos thrived. With access to consistent, high-quality physical therapy, funded in part by the restitution settlement, his mobility and physical confidence improved significantly. More importantly, his spirit blossomed. He joined the high school's acclaimed robotics club, his sharp, analytical mind finding a challenging and rewarding new outlet. He made friends easily. While he still faced the daily challenges associated with cerebral palsy, the crushing weight of Carol Albright's persecution, the constant fear and humiliation, was gone, lifted forever. He sometimes helped his father, Roberto, who had started his own small landscaping business, with yard work on weekends now, but only when he chose to, working at his own pace, enjoying the sunshine. The occasional clang of his leg braces on pavement was no longer a sound associated with forced labor and fear, but simply the sound of a resilient young man navigating his world, claiming his space on his own terms. The harsh, unforgiving winter landscape of Willow Creek Crossing eventually yielded, as it always does, to the gentle, hopeful green of spring. The melting snow revealed lawns that were perhaps less uniformly perfect than in Carol Albright's rigid rain, hinting at the diverse, complex, imperfectly human lives unfolding behind the front doors. It was a community slowly, painstakingly healing. A community forced to confront the darkness hidden beneath its polished surface, learning the crucial, painful difference between maintaining reasonable community standards and enforcing prejudice, cruelty, and exploitation wrapped in the insidious guise of order. Justice, delivered through the decisive actions of a determined attorney general, the unwavering courage of victims willing to speak their truth, and the collective awakening of a neighborhood, had not only swiftly and severely punished the guilty. It had also, more importantly, cleared the path for a hard-working, targeted family to finally, truly, irrevocably, call this place home. The air on Aspen Lane felt cleaner, lighter, freer.